The bright lights of Station Nexus 7 flashed across Joon Kim's face as he made his way through the crowded main concourse. Beings from a dozen different star systems pushed past him, some with too many limbs, others floating rather than walking. After 3 months on the station, Joon still found himself amazed by the diversity. Today was different, though. Today he had a job to do. Engineer Kim, report to Docking Bay 12 immediately. The station's AI announced over his personal comm unit. Earth Diplomatic Corps requests your presence for first contact technical assistance. Joon quickened his pace. This was his first official assignment since being posted to Nexus 7 as Earth's technical liaison. Most days he just answered questions about human machinery or helped fix the station's recycling systems. Nothing exciting. The doors to Bay 12 slid open, revealing a ship unlike any Joon had seen before. It resembled a massive dragonfly with its wings folded back, gleaming with a strange purple-black metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Ambassador Lee nodded at Joon as he approached. Engineer Kim, thank you for coming quickly. The Trellans arrived 3 hours ago with engine trouble. Their ship's primary drive module has malfunctioned. Joon studied the vessel with growing excitement. The Trellans were new to the Galactic Alliance, and their propulsion technology was rumored to be decades ahead of Earth's best systems. Have they requested assistance? Joon asked. Not exactly, Ambassador Lee said with a grimace. But diplomatic protocol requires us to offer help when a visiting delegation experiences technical difficulties in our territory. 4 tall figures emerged from beneath the ship. Joon had to force himself not to stare. The Trellans stood nearly 8 feet tall, their bodies covered in iridescent exoskeletons that shifted colors as they moved. Their heads featured complex arrangements of antennae and compound eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Ambassador Lee stepped forward, making the formal greeting gestures they had been briefed on. Honored visitors, this is Engineer Joon Kim, our station's technical specialist. He would be happy to assist with your drive module issues. The tallest Trellan's antennae twitched, and a series of clicking sounds emerged from its mandibles. The translator unit pinned to Ambassador Lee's collar converted the sounds to words. Most amusing. We require no primitive assistance. Joon felt his face flush, but maintained his professional smile. I understand your technology is advanced, but sometimes a fresh perspective can be helpful. I have experience with various propulsion systems. The Trellan delegation's mandibles moved in unison, producing a synchronized clicking that the translator didn't convert. Joon recognized it anyway. Laughter. The lead Trellan, who introduced himself as Chief Engineer Back, waved one of his 4 upper limbs dismissively. Human, your species barely mastered basic fusion drives a century ago. Our quantum displacement technology is beyond your comprehension. It would be like asking a Stone Age toolmaker to repair a superconductor. Ambassador Lee shot Joon a warning glance that clearly said, "Don't make this worse." Joon took a deep breath. I understand your concern, but engineering principles often transcend specific technologies. Sometimes the simplest issues can cause the most complex systems to fail. Chief Engineer Back's compound eyes seemed to study Joon more carefully. After a moment, the translator conveyed, "Your optimism is charming if misguided. You may observe our repair process if you wish. Perhaps you will learn something useful for your primitive vessels." Joon nodded politely, recognizing the condescension, but also the opportunity. Getting to observe Trellan technology up close was more than any human engineer had been granted before. The Trellan repair team led Joon beneath their ship, where a panel had been removed to reveal a bewildering array of components. Some parts glowed with inner light, while others seemed to fade in and out of physical existence. "This is our primary drive module," explained Back, pointing to a central component that pulsed with blue energy. "It has developed an efficiency degradation that we cannot yet isolate." Joon watched carefully as the Trellans connected diagnostic devices to various parts of the system. Holographic displays filled the air around them, showing data in a format Joon couldn't begin to decipher. "What symptoms are you experiencing?" June asked, trying to understand the problem in practical terms. Back's antennae twitched again. The drive produces a 3.7% power fluctuation during the transition from standard to superluminal velocities. This creates harmonic instabilities throughout the quantum field. June nodded as though this made complete sense to him. And when did the problem first appear? After our last maintenance cycle at the Trellin homeworld, Back replied. We have verified all quantum algorithms and field parameters. The issue is most puzzling. As the Trellins continued their diagnostics, Jun noticed something odd about the mounting bracket that held the drive module. It seemed slightly off-center, just a tiny fraction of an inch, but enough that it caught his experienced eye. Excuse me, Jun said hesitantly, but is that mounting bracket supposed to be at that angle? The Trellins all turned to look at him, their compound eyes unreadable. The physical mounting is irrelevant, Back said dismissively. The drive functions through quantum field manipulation, not mechanical processes. June nodded politely, but made a mental note of the misalignment. In his experience, no matter how advanced the technology, physical mounting and alignment always mattered. As the Trellins continued their increasingly frustrated attempts to solve the problem through their sophisticated diagnostic tools, Jun watched silently. He was beginning to form a theory, but knew better than to push his ideas on the clearly superior aliens who had already dismissed his capabilities. The first meeting ended with no progress made, the Trellins clicking irritably among themselves as they sealed up the access panel. As June left with Ambassador Lee, he couldn't help but wonder if the solution might be simpler than the Trellins were willing to consider. For the next 3 days, June returned to the Trellin ship each morning. The aliens allowed him to watch their repair efforts, though they largely ignored his presence. He stood quietly in the corner of their engine room, observing their methodical work and taking mental notes. The Trellins moved with impressive coordination. Their 6-fingered hands manipulated tools so advanced they seemed magical to June. Some devices hovered in midair, projecting colorful diagrams that the aliens studied intently. Others seemed to phase through solid matter to reach hidden components. The quantum field stabilizer shows no degradation. One Trellin technician reported on the second day. All algorithms are functioning within normal parameters. Chief Engineer Back's antennae twitched in frustration. Run the harmonic sweep again. Increase sensitivity by 20%. June watched as vibrant holographic displays filled the air, showing wave patterns that pulsed and shifted. He didn't understand the alien mathematics, but he recognized patterns when he saw them. Something about the rhythmic fluctuations seemed familiar. During his lunch break, June sat alone in the station's cafeteria, sketching the wave patterns he'd seen on a small tablet. Where had he encountered something similar before? Then it hit him. The mining equipment problem on Mars Colony 4 years ago. When he returned to the Trellin ship that afternoon, the aliens were still running tests with no success. June cleared his throat nervously. Excuse me, Chief Engineer Back. I noticed something in your diagnostic readings that reminds me of a problem I once solved. The Trellin's compound eyes swiveled toward him. The other technicians paused their work briefly before continuing, as if June hadn't spoken. Oh, and what might that be, human? Back's translator conveyed his words, but couldn't hide the dismissive tone. June pulled out his tablet and showed his rough sketches. These wave patterns in your drive system, they look similar to what we saw in some mining drills on Mars when there was a mechanical resonance issue. Back stared at the sketches, then made that familiar clicking sound that indicated amusement or derision. Engineer Kim, with all respect to your species' developing intelligence, you are comparing quantum field manipulators that bend space-time to digging tools. The other Trellins joined in the clicking laughter. June felt his face grow hot, but he persisted. The principles might be similar despite the different technologies. In our case, a minor physical misalignment created vibration patterns that amplified through the system. I noticed your drive module's mounting bracket seems slightly off-center. Back's antennae flattened against his head. Human, Your persistence is admirable but misplaced. The physical housing is merely a container. The actual drive functions through 11-dimensional quantum manipulation. A millimeter of physical displacement is irrelevant. But what if? Jun began. We have centuries of experience with this technology, Back interrupted. While we appreciate your enthusiasm, please allow us to continue our work. The dismissal was clear. Jun nodded and stepped back, embarrassed but unconvinced. He spent the remainder of the day watching silently as the Trellans tried increasingly complex diagnostic procedures without success. That evening, Jun couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the Trellan drive system and the strange similarity to the Mars mining equipment. Opening his personal terminal, he pulled up his old reports from that mission and compared them to his notes on the Trellan system. The underlying pattern was unmistakable. Despite the vast technological gap, the symptoms matched. In the Mars case, a simple mechanical issue had created complex vibrational patterns that confused the computerized diagnostics. By morning of the fourth day, the mood in the Trellan ship had grown tense. Back received a communication from his homeworld that clearly agitated him. The High Council demands we resolve this issue within 48 hours, he told his team. Our diplomatic mission cannot be delayed further. Jun watched the aliens work with increased urgency. They replaced several components and ran even more sophisticated tests. But the problem persisted. A 3.7% power fluctuation during drive transitions. During a brief break when the Trellans huddled to discuss their next approach, Jun slipped closer to the drive module and studied it carefully. The misalignment in the mounting bracket was subtle but definite, about 2 millimeters off true center. Such a tiny error, yet potentially significant. When the aliens resumed work, Jun cautiously approached Back again. Chief Engineer, I've been studying similar vibrational patterns in Earth technology, and I really think the mounting bracket could be causing harmonic resonance throughout your system. If we adjusted it, Back's exoskeleton flashed a deep red color that Jun hadn't seen before. The translator struggled with the rapid clicking that followed, but eventually produced. Engineer Kim, your persistence borders on offensive. We have indulged your presence as a diplomatic courtesy, but please do not mistake this for an invitation to impose primitive mechanical concepts on quantum technology. The other Trellans had stopped working to watch the exchange. Jun felt every compound eye in the room fixed on him. I apologize for any offense, Jun said quietly. I'm simply offering an alternative perspective. Your perspective, Back responded, comes from a species that achieved spaceflight mere generations ago. Our civilization mastered quantum physics before your ancestors invented the wheel. This is not a problem that can be solved with wrenches and hammers. Jun nodded and stepped back. He spent the rest of the day watching in silence as the Trellans tried and failed with increasingly desperate measures. As he left that evening, he noticed new stress fractures forming around the misaligned bracket, tiny but telling. That night, Jun lay awake in his quarters, torn between respecting the Trellans' expertise and following his engineering instincts. Sometimes the most advanced minds overlooked the simplest solutions. He'd seen it countless times, even among human engineers. Brilliant physicists stumped by basic mechanical failures. By morning, Jun had made his decision. If the Trellans wouldn't consider his theory, he would have to find another way to help. The fifth day brought a noticeable change to the Trellan ship. 2 new aliens had arrived, their exoskeletons decorated with elaborate markings that suggested high rank. They spoke with Chief Engineer Back in rapid clicks and whistles that the translator couldn't keep up with. Even without understanding the words, Jun could tell the conversation wasn't pleasant. Back's antennae drooped visibly as the officials departed. He turned to his team, his normally confident posture now stiff with tension. The High Council is most displeased with our lack of progress, Back announced. The diplomatic summit cannot be delayed further. We must fix the drive system today or face serious consequences. The repair team worked with renewed intensity. They replaced more components and ran increasingly complex diagnostic routines. Holographic displays filled the engine room with swirling patterns of light and data. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the energy of their efforts. June watched from his usual corner, careful to stay out of the way. The Trellans had barely acknowledged his presence this morning, too focused on their mounting crisis to bother with diplomatic niceties. As the day progressed, Jun noticed something new. Every time the Trellans ran a test cycle on the drive, a faint vibration passed through the floor beneath his feet. It was so subtle that he felt rather than heard it. A tiny tremor that occurred exactly when the power fluctuation appeared in their readings. During a brief moment when the team paused to analyze results, Jun quietly moved closer to the drive module. He placed his hand on the floor near the base of the unit, feeling for the vibration. There it was, a slight tremor that matched perfectly with the power spikes in the Trellan diagnostics. Following the vibration, Jun traced it to its source, the mounting bracket he had noticed days ago. Now he could see that the problem was worse than he'd initially thought. The bracket wasn't just misaligned. It had a tiny fracture, barely visible to the naked eye. Each time the drive activated, the fracture allowed microscopic movement, creating vibrations that propagated through the entire system. Engineer Kim, Bak's voice startled him. "What are you doing?" Jun straightened up quickly. "I found something you might want to see." The Trellan's compound eyes studied him coldly. "We have no time for distractions. The High Council has made it clear that failure is not acceptable." "This will only take a minute," Jun insisted, pointing to the bracket. "There's a fracture here, and it's creating vibrations that match your power fluctuations perfectly." Bak's mandibles clicked rapidly. "That is impossible. Our diagnostics would have detected any significant mechanical failure." "That's just it," Jun explained. "Your diagnostics are calibrated for quantum-level issues, not basic mechanical problems. You're looking for complex failures when the issue is actually very simple." One of the other Trellans stepped forward. "Chief, perhaps we should investigate. We have tried everything else." Bak's antennae twitched with irritation, but he finally nodded. "Very well. Show us this fracture." Jun pointed out the tiny crack in the mounting bracket. It was almost invisible unless viewed from exactly the right angle. "This bracket holds your entire drive module in place," Jun explained. "When the drive activates, the fracture allows the module to shift by a few micrometers. That tiny movement creates vibrations that resonate through your quantum field, causing the power fluctuations." Bak leaned closer, his compound eyes focusing and refocusing as he examined the bracket. For several long moments, he was silent. Then he straightened up and turned to his team. "Recalibrate the molecular scanner to physical structure analysis. Focus on the mounting assembly." The technicians quickly adjusted their equipment. A new holographic display appeared, showing a detailed scan of the bracket. The fracture was clearly visible now, highlighted in angry red against the blue structure. "Impossible," one of the technicians whispered. "How did we miss this?" "Because we weren't looking for it," Bak said quietly. His voice carried a new tone, one the translator rendered as reluctant respect. "Our diagnostics are designed to detect quantum field irregularities, not physical damage to the housing components." The tension in the room shifted. The Trellans gathered around the display, clicking rapidly to each other as they analyzed the scan results. Jun stood back, trying not to look too satisfied. Bak finally turned to him. "It seems you have identified a possibility we overlooked. How would you suggest we proceed, Engineer Kim?" The question caught Jun by surprise. After days of dismissal, being asked for his opinion felt like a major victory. "The bracket needs to be replaced or repaired," Jun said. "If you have replacement parts, that would be best. If not, we could potentially reinforce the existing bracket to prevent further movement." Bak consulted with his team briefly. "We have no replacement brackets aboard. The components were custom manufactured for this vessel." "Then reinforcement is our best option," Jun said. "Do you have any high-strength bonding materials? Something that can withstand the stresses of drive activation?" The Trellans discussed among themselves. their clicking language too fast for the translator to keep up. Finally, Back nodded. "We have quantum-stabilized adhesive that might serve the purpose. It was designed for emergency repairs to the hull, not internal components, but the molecular bonding principles should apply." "That sounds perfect," Jim said. "We'll need to clean the fracture area thoroughly, apply the adhesive, and then hold the bracket in perfect alignment while it sets." For the first time, the Trellans seemed truly willing to consider June's suggestions. They retrieved the adhesive and began preparing the repair area according to his instructions. As they worked together, June noticed a subtle change in the alien's behavior toward him. The dismissive clicks were gone, replaced by attentive silence when he spoke. Even Back seemed to be reassessing his initial judgment. By late afternoon, they were ready to test the repair. The entire team watched anxiously as the drive system powered up. June held his breath as the diagnostics displayed the familiar wave patterns. But this time, there was no fluctuation. The power curve remained perfectly stable throughout the test cycle. "Power output steady at 100%, a technician reported. "No fluctuations detected. Field integrity at optimal levels." A strange sound filled the engine room, a harmonious clicking that June had never heard before. The translator eventually rendered it as something close to applause. Back turned to June, his exoskeleton shifting to a deep blue color. "It seems, Engineer Kim, that we owe you an apology. And our thanks." June couldn't sleep that night. Despite the successful test, the repair they had made was temporary at best. The quantum-stabilized adhesive would hold for now, but June knew from experience that vibrations would eventually weaken even the strongest bonds. The Trellans needed a more permanent solution before attempting their journey home. He sat up in his bed, staring at the ceiling of his small station quarters. The Trellans had thanked him, yes, but they had still rejected his suggestion for a more thorough repair. Chief Engineer Back had insisted that the adhesive would be sufficient until they reached their homeworld, where proper replacements could be manufactured. "But what if it fails during transit?" Jun had asked. "The probability is acceptably low," Back had replied, his tone making it clear the discussion was over. Jun glanced at his clock. 200 hours. Most of the station would be in sleep cycle now, including the Trellan delegation. An idea began to form in his mind. Risky, potentially career-ending, but technically sound. He got up and opened the small locker beside his bed. Inside was his personal toolkit, a gift from his grandfather when June had first joined the space program. It contained simple, reliable tools that hadn't changed much in design for centuries: wrenches, screwdrivers, pliers, and a small welding torch. Sometimes the simplest tools solve the most complex problems, his grandfather had told him. Those words echoed in June's mind as he packed the kit into a shoulder bag. The corridors of Nexus 7 were dimly lit during night cycle. June moved confidently but cautiously, nodding to the few station personnel he passed. His position as Earth's technical liaison gave him access to most areas, including the docking bays, but what he planned to do went well beyond his authority. Docking Bay 12 was quiet when he arrived. The Trellan ship loomed in the shadows, its strange organic-looking hull absorbing the minimal light. June approached the access hatch, wondering if the aliens had locked it. To his surprise, it slid open at his touch. Different cultural assumptions about security, he muttered to himself as he slipped inside. The ship's interior was dimly lit by bioluminescent panels that gave off a soft blue glow. June moved carefully, grateful that the Trellans had shown him enough of the vessel's layout that he could find his way to the engine room without guidance. He froze when he heard clicking sounds from a nearby corridor. 2 Trellan voices. June pressed himself against the wall, hoping the shadows would conceal him. The aliens passed by an intersection without turning his way, their conversation fading as they moved deeper into the ship. After waiting a few minutes to ensure they were gone, June continued to the engine room. The door opened silently, revealing the now familiar space with its bewildering array of technology. The drive module sat at the center, its power indicators dimmed during the inactive cycle. Jun set his toolkit down and got to work. First, he carefully removed the access panel they had resealed earlier that day. The repaired bracket was visible now, the quantum adhesive glowing faintly along the fracture line. As he had suspected, the adhesive had already begun to develop stress lines. The Trellan's quick fix wouldn't last more than a few days at most. Jun knew he needed to implement a more permanent solution. From his toolkit, he took out a small device that his grandfather had added, a mechanical alignment gauge that used simple principles of physics to measure true level and center. No electronics, no quantum fields, just precisely machined parts that worked together with gravity to find perfect alignment. Jun placed the gauge against the bracket and confirmed what he already knew. The entire mounting assembly was off by 2.3 millimeters from true center. Over time, this misalignment had created stress on the bracket, eventually causing the fracture. Time for some old-school engineering, he whispered to himself. From his kit, he removed a set of thin metal shims of various thicknesses. These simple pieces of metal had been used by mechanics for centuries to adjust alignments in machinery. Jun selected several that, when combined, would exactly compensate for the misalignment. Working with painstaking care, he loosened the mounting bolts just enough to slide the shims into place. Each time he adjusted a bolt, he checked the alignment with his gauge, making tiny corrections until everything was perfectly centered. With the bracket now properly aligned, Jun turned his attention to reinforcing the repair. The Trellan's adhesive was impressive, but it wasn't designed for this application. From his kit, he took out a small welding torch and some filler metal specifically designed for high-stress mechanical joints. He carefully applied small welds around the bracket, reinforcing the weakest points without creating new stress concentrations. The work was delicate. Too much heat could damage the surrounding components, while too little wouldn't create a strong enough bond. Sweat beaded on Jun's forehead as he completed the final weld. He sat back and examined his work with critical eyes. The repair wasn't pretty. The Trellans would certainly notice the rough human welding compared to their elegant technology, but it was solid. The bracket was now perfectly aligned and reinforced to withstand the stresses of normal operation. Jun reassembled everything, careful to return all components to their exact positions. As a final touch, he used a small piece of cleaning cloth to wipe away any fingerprints or evidence of his work, though he knew the welding itself would be impossible to hide. Just as he was packing up his tools, Jun heard a sound that made his heart skip, clicking mandibles, coming from the corridor outside the engine room. Someone was approaching. Jun looked frantically around the room. There was nowhere to hide. He could only stand there, toolkit in hand, as the door slid open to reveal a Trellan technician. The alien froze, compound eyes widening in what Jun assumed was shock. For a long moment, they stared at each other in silence. Then the Trellan looked past Jun to the drive module, noticing the fresh welds on the bracket. More clicking sounds emerged, but without the translator, Jun couldn't understand what was being said. The alien approached the drive module, examining Jun's work with obvious interest. It ran a slender appendage over the welds, then turned back to Jun. To Jun's surprise, the Trellan made a gesture he recognized from their cultural briefings, a respectful acknowledgement between professionals. Then, without a word, the alien turned and left the engine room, leaving Jun alone with his racing heart. Had he just ruined his career, or had the technician somehow approved of his unauthorized repair? Jun quickly finished gathering his tools and made his way out of the ship. The corridors remained empty, and he reached the station without further encounters. By the time he returned to his quarters, it was nearly 400 hours. As he stored his toolkit away, Jun wondered what the morning would bring. Would the Trellans report his intrusion? Would the repair even work as he intended? Only time would tell. Despite his anxiety, Jun felt a small sense of pride. Whatever happened next, he had done what any good engineer would do: fixed the problem properly, using the right tools for the job. Jun arrived at docking bay, 12 the next morning with a mix of dread and hope. He had slept poorly, expecting security officers to knock on his door at any moment. As he approached the Trellin ship, he noticed unusual activity. A crowd had gathered, station personnel, diplomats, and aliens from various species, all watching as the Trellin delegation stood proudly before their vessel. Chief Engineer Back was at the center, his exoskeleton shimmering with vibrant blue patterns that June had learned indicated excitement or pride. When Back spotted June trying to blend into the crowd, he pointed with one long appendage. "There he is, the human engineer who solved our problem." All eyes turned to June. Ambassador Lee appeared at his side, looking confused but pleased. "Engineer Kim, what exactly did you do? The Trellins have been asking for you all morning." Before June could answer, Back approached and made a formal greeting gesture. "Engineer Kim, our drive system is now functioning at 103% efficiency, better than factory specifications. We ran a full diagnostic cycle this morning and found your modifications." June swallowed hard. "I apologize for entering your ship without permission. I just thought." "No apologies are necessary," Back interrupted. "Your solution was both elegant and effective. Our security systems recorded your work, and we have studied it carefully." One of the high-ranking Trellins stepped forward. The translator identified him as Council Representative Tal. "Engineer Kim, your approach has fascinated our technical division. You achieved with simple mechanical tools what our quantum diagnostics could not detect." June felt his face grow warm with embarrassment. It was nothing special, just basic mechanical alignment principles. My grandfather taught me that sometimes the simplest approach works best. "Simplest, yet most profound," Tal replied. "We had become so focused on the quantum aspects of our technology that we neglected the physical foundation upon which it rests." Ambassador Lee looked stunned. "I'm sorry, but what exactly did Engineer Kim do?" Back's mandibles clicked in what June now recognized as amused respect. "He fixed our drive with metal shims and welding. Techniques our civilization hasn't used in common practice for centuries. And yet, his repair is more durable than our initial solution." News of June's midnight repair spread quickly through Station Nexus 7. By lunchtime, he could hardly walk through the corridors without being stopped by curious station personnel and visiting aliens. "Is it true you fixed the Trellin ship with hand tools?" a Centaurian trader asked him in the cafeteria. "Did you really weld quantum technology?" questioned a human colleague. Jun tried to explain that he had only fixed a simple mechanical issue, not the quantum technology itself, but the story grew with each retelling. 3 days later, Jun was called to the station commander's office. He entered nervously, still half expecting to be reprimanded for unauthorized access to an alien vessel. Instead, he found Commander Park smiling broadly beside Representative Tal. "Engineer Kim, the Trellin High Council has made a formal request," Commander Park announced. "They want to establish an exchange program between Earth and Trellia, focusing on engineering practices." "They? What?" June blinked in surprise. Representative Tal's antennae waved in what June had learned was a gesture of enthusiasm. "Your approach to our drive system has caused quite the philosophical debate among our engineers. For centuries, we have focused on advancing our quantum understanding, while letting our knowledge of basic mechanical principles fade. This incident has revealed a blind spot in our technical education. Your grandfather's wisdom about simple solutions has proven applicable across interstellar cultures," Commander Park added with a smile. Over the following weeks, more alien ships began requesting Jun's assistance with various technical problems. A Proximan vessel with atmospheric regulation issues, an Aldebaranian shuttle with navigation system failures. In each case, Jun found that beneath the advanced technology lay simple mechanical or physical problems that their specialists had overlooked. Station Nexus 7 officially designated Jun as Interspecies Technical Liaison, a new position created specifically for him. Engineers from Earth were suddenly in high demand throughout the sector, valued for their practical approach to complex problems. 1 month after the Trellin incident, Jun received a package from Chief Engineer Back. Inside was a small device, beautifully crafted from the same purple-black metal as their ship. When activated, it projected a holographic image of Jun's welding repair alongside a quote in both Trellin and human language. Sometimes the simplest solution is the one the smartest people overlook. The device now sat on Jun's desk in his new larger office. Whenever visiting engineers, human or alien, asked about his sudden fame, he would activate the hologram and tell the story of the midnight repair. The most advanced technology still obeys the basic laws of physics, he would explain. No matter how sophisticated our systems become, they still exist in the physical world. 6 months later, as Jun prepared to depart for the first official engineering exchange on the Trellin homeworld, he packed his grandfather's toolkit first. The simple tools had opened a new chapter in interspecies relations, bridging the gap between quantum theory and practical mechanics. As he looked out the viewport at the stars beyond Nexus 7, Jun smiled. His grandfather would have loved this story. How a misaligned bracket and a midnight repair had changed the course of interstellar engineering. The end.